email and read it based on how well crafted the subject line is. In this video, we'll go over how to write the perfect subject line for your emails so that they're more effective and have higher open rates by your team. So let's start with what makes a good subject line. The first is that it summarizes the email. So a good subject line is one that summarizes what the email is about, and in 2 seconds, the recipients should get the gist of what you're trying to tell them. So for example, if you say something like "Hi there" in the subject line, that doesn't convey anything meaningful. The second is that it helps with email retrieval. And another trait of a well-crafted subject line is that it will help you search through your email archives to easily retrieve out any emails that you're looking for at a later date. So in a lot of cases today, people use their email as an archive tool, and with 100,000 emails in your inbox, it helps when you have subject lines that are meaningful and you can easily pick out off all the other emails in your inbox. And in the next few minutes, we'll go over 4 tips that will help you write the perfect subject line and achieve those goals. Tip number 1 is about including the 3 W's that we talked about earlier. So if the email includes actions you need someone or a few people to do, then add the who, the what, and the when, but in an abbreviated way in the subject line. So for example, Michael, need your report by tomorrow's COB, right? So again, here it has the who, it has the what, and then in an abbreviated way, we've got Tom, which stands for tomorrow, and then COB, which stands for close of business. And a good habit is to also type action at the beginning of the subject line to stress importance. So for example, action, Jim, reminder to send the slides by Wednesday at 5 p.m. Again, we've got the who, we've got the what, which is a reminder to send the slides, and then the when here in an abbreviated fashion, and then the word or prefix action helps in stressing the importance that this is something that Jim has to take care of. The second tip is to use prefix modifiers. So if the email is not an action-oriented one, in other words, the 3 W's don't apply, then add other prefix modifiers such as urgent, confidential, IMP, which stands for important, or FYI, which stands for your information, in the subject line to explain what the email is about. So in the previous tip, we talked about action being the prefix modifier because that had the 3 W's apply. But if you don't have an action-oriented email, then typing one of those other prefix modifiers such as confidential or FYI helps a lot. And make sure you include the prefix at the beginning of the subject line because it might get truncated or missed at the end. And let me give you an example of that. So a bad example would be the following subject line: info regarding your June 9th trip before you leave, and then urgent at the end. And the problem here is that by having urgent listed at the end, it might get truncated with some of the words here when you're using smaller screens. And I'll give you an example and show you exactly what I mean by that. A better example would be to say something like urgent, info regarding your June 9th trip before you leave. And in this case, the recipient is going to see the word urgent first and then the information after that and pick up on it. So let me give you an example of how this looks like on a smartphone. So I sent myself some emails here. I did grade this out just to kind of show you how it looks like. And as you can see, if I'm looking through my iPhone, I do see the subject line here. And as you can tell, it just says info regarding a June 9th trip before you, and then LE ... And the urgent, which was at the end of that subject line, does not show up. However, with the second good example, you can tell that the word urgent shows up at the beginning, and then the truncated words at the end are extraneous information that I don't need. So in this case, it's a bad example where I could miss out on seeing the word urgent, and in this case, the word urgent shows up immediately, and so that's a much better example of using the prefix modifier at the beginning of your subject line. The third tip is to write the entire email in your subject line. So if your email is extremely short, then use the subject line itself as the entire email, just like you would in a text message, just like SMS, for example, and suffix it with EOM, which stands for end of message. So here's one example. Sunil, the team decided on the Cheesecake Factory for lunch at 1 p.m. EOM. Another example is quick question, did you upgrade to the latest version of iOS? end of message, right? So again, just like an SMS text message, you're sending a quick note and people will actually appreciate that. The fourth tip is to change the subject only when needed. So when you're replying to an email, avoid modifying the subject line unless you absolutely have to. And that's because it will make it harder to keep track of the conversation and search for any emails later on. Now, most email programs identify emails based on the subject line text, and some even group them using what's called conversation threading, where messages are visually grouped together with their replies. So changing the subject line will actually mess that feature up. I'm sure you've seen that on your iPhone, where the messages that are all related to the same subject line appear on one thread. Gmail does that as well as Outlook if you turn that feature on. And if you change the subject line, you're going to mess with that feature where it kind of shows multiple threads going on. Now, when you're replying to an email, change the subject line when you have the following situations. The first is when the topic itself changes. In other words, the original subject line does not apply anymore. And in that case, start a new email thread with a new subject line and state something like, "Team, I'm moving this conversation to a new email thread so that things don't get confusing." And if you need to, you can actually copy paste the original email thread in that, but that way you kind of keep those separate. Another situation is when you're removing recipients from an email due to confidentiality reasons, for example, right? And in that case, start a new subject line by adding a prefix modifier, like removing vendor or internal only, so that everyone's aware of what you've done. So here's a quick summary of what we just covered. The perfect subject line summarizes the topic of the email and helps with email retrieval later on. And to help achieve that, there are 4 tips that you should follow. Tip number 1 is to include the 3 W's, the who, the what, and the when, in an abbreviated fashion in the subject line. Tip number 2 is to use prefix modifiers such as action or important or FYI. Tip number 3 is to write the entire email in the subject line, just like a text message, and make sure you use EOM for end of message. And then tip number 4 is to change the subject line only when you absolutely need to. That's it. Thank you so much for watching, and in the next video, we'll